On this short video, I want to mention a few words about the weekly reading Bechukotai. This is the last parsha of the third book of Moshe, Sefer Vayikra. And in this parsha, the main topic is various warnings what will happen if we do not listen to Hashem. And our long exile is predicted. Now, the truth of the matter is there are two parshiot, which we call Tochecha, rebuke. The custom is to read this parshiot in a low tone of voice. So they're very easily recognized when the Chazan all of a sudden starts reading much quieter all those verses that deal with the various curses, the various terrible things that will happen to our people. And one has to realize that all these curses are conditional. They did not all have to necessarily occur, depending on how bad we really would be. But for the most part, almost everything written in this parsha and in the end of KiTavo, the other parsha of Tochecha, almost everything came true, unfortunately, through our many sins. And the Zohar Hadash says openly already by the time of the Zohar that pretty much all of those curses were already happened. And the Vilna Gaon in his commentary on the Tikkun Zohar Hadash there says that the first Tochecha, the parsha we'll read this Shabbat, those curses came true during the first exile, the exile to Babylon, and then the second curses came true when the Romans exiled our people about some 600 or so years, plus or minus, later than that. The first exile ended just in 70 years, but the majority of the Jewish people still remained outside the land of Israel, and then we had the second temple, and according to Chazal, after 420 years, according to some other opinions, and some of the Orthodox Jews accept this, the alternative chronology, it happened about 600 years later, depending on how long the second temple stood. That temple was also destroyed, and the Jewish people went to exile again. It doesn't mean, by the way, that there were no Jews left at all in Eretz Israel. There were always Jews in the land of Israel, sometimes more, sometimes less. We never completely abandoned the land, but the vast majority of Jews ended up in various countries. It's known that the majority of European Jews are part of the second exile. Many of the Sephardi, what's called Jews, the more correct term is Edot HaMizrach, the Eastern Jews, a lot of them at least, come from the first exile. They just never returned from the Babylonian exile and kept spreading all over the Middle East and further countries. Some of them went as far as the former Soviet Union, republics of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Some of them ended up in North Africa, all the way to Morocco. The Jews ended up living pretty much in almost in every country in the world, but the main bulk of the first exile ended up being Sephardi Jews, and the main bulk of the second exile after the Roman exile ended up as European Jews. This is genetically proven that we come from the Middle East, despite the efforts in the last 100 years, actually even less than that. In less than 100 years, actually, the tremendous amount of work by those who hate us and by various so-called Palestinians and others who try to spread their point of view, made it look as if we have nothing to do with the original Jews, we're not their descendants, and they are the true inhabitants of the land of Israel, which of course is completely reverse from the truth. There were no Arabs living in the land of Israel until the conquest after Muhammad, which was about 2,000 years after the Jews already lived there. And there's, by the way, no scientist and no archaeologist that ever doubted there was such a thing as the first temple. The fact that today it's a common thing for the so-called Palestinians to deny it, to destroy all the artifacts in the first temple, this is completely ridiculous. And just 100 years ago, their own leaders, the leaders of the Arabs in the land of Israel, used to make it a big deal that their mosque is in the place of the Temple of Solomon. Nobody ever doubted that there was a Temple of Solomon and that the Jews were exiled and then came back and then exiled again, and that during the times of Hashmonaim, it was primarily the Jews who lived in the entire land of Israel and had the Jewish kingdom for over 100 years. And then later in the times of Herod, Hordes, we had a somewhat puppet state that depended on the Roman government, but it still was somewhat a Jewish government. Hordes himself was a descendant of Edomites, but he apparently accepted to some extent Judaism, and therefore it was considered a kingdom of Judea for the entire time. And then we were exiled again, but the Arabs came there only after Muhammad at a much, much later time. So, and by the way, they weren't calling themselves Palestinians until recently. So the whole thing was invented in the 20th century. Even in the passports, it was the Jews who were called Palestinians then, because the Romans used to call this place Palestine, and then later, of course, the Arabs that started calling themselves Palestinians in order to somehow connect to that land. But in reality, there is nothing different about Arabs living there. A lot of them, even their last names show where they come from. Some from Syria, some from Egypt. Some of these families lived a few hundred years maybe in the land of Israel. A lot of them, the majority probably, came at the end of 19th, beginning of 20th century. In fact, it was the infrastructure that was built during the 20th century after the British mandate. That's when it became attractive for a lot of the Arabs to emigrate into that land. Many of them came just a few years before the state of Israel. But even those who lived there for a few hundred years, they certainly didn't live there for thousands upon thousands of years like the Jews did. In fact, it's true about every country around the land of Israel. Moab, Ammon, Edom, the Midianites, the Syrians, Aram, the Phoenicians, all of these countries today are Arabic countries, but they weren't always Arabic. They didn't have not only religion Islam, but the language or Arabic language or any of these other traits of what makes Muslim Arabs today. So all of these people, they either some of them were killed and some of them were converted into the new religion, but as a nation, all of these ceased to exist. So it's the only original inhabitants, in fact, of the entire area are the Jews. The Jews still live in the land of Israel. The Moabites don't live in today's state of Jordan, etc. Right? The Aram does not live in today's Syria. Ashur or Kasdim do not live in today's Iraq. Right? The ancient Babylonians and the ancient Assyrians do not live any longer in Iraq. None of these nations exist anymore. All of them became occupied by Arabs. It was an Arab conquest. So when the Jews are being told that we're the colonizers, it's Arabs who were the colonizers who occupied all these lands, and now everything became reversed. They call themselves the Palestinians. What's Palestinians? Plishtim? They have nothing to do with Plishtim. Those were from the Greek Isles, a relatively small nation which existed for quite a while in the land of Israel, but certainly didn't exist anywhere near the period when the Arabs conquered it. And like I said, in the entire Second Temple period already, there was no Plishtim. Although it was because of the name of Plishtim that the Romans called this place Palestine, to kind of erase the name of Judea. They were so angry with the Jews, the Jews who revolted in order to try to gain independence, that the Romans called it Palestine. And since then, it was this name that was preserved for quite a while. But that has nothing to do with today's Arabs who call themselves Palestinians. Whatever the case may be, the fact that the Jews were in the land of Israel 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago after the first exile, 2,000 years ago around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, and afterwards, this no scientist ever argued. There are minimalists, there are maximalists among various scientists. Of course, none of them take the Bible's word for granted or don't really believe in the Torah, but that doesn't mean that the main pattern of our history was ever disputed. The Torah was already translated into Greek 2,300 years ago. It was a little bit before the Hashmonaim rebellion, the rebellion that gave the Jews a state that was independent. Before that, the Jews were under various countries left after Alexander the Great, Alexander Macedonsky died. There were two main countries. There were a few countries that rose in the place of his former empire from the generals, the dynasties that ruled these countries, but from the generals of Alexander. But the two that are the most important in our history were the north and the south, and that is the Seleucids. Most of the names of the rulers were Antiochuses. The one that the Hanukkah rebellion happened during his time was Antiochus Epiphanes IV, but there were other ones before him. And then there were Ptolemies who ruled in Egypt. Jews usually call them King Ptolemy. Ptolemy was called Ptolemy, just a simple reduction of the name of sorts. So these Ptolemies ruled in Egypt, and at the time when the Jews had to translate the Torah into the Greek, it was under the Ptolemies. The Judea was then ruled by Ptolemies. And since then, there was an independent transfer of Greek translation of the Torah, so-called Septuagint, the translation of 70 or 72 elders, whatever the case may be. So the things that the Torah says, at least from that period of time, even people who don't believe in the Torah at all, even the most minimalist scientists will not dispute that since that time there was no real changes, any significant changes in the nusach of the Torah, on the level more than of letters. I mean, there were always questions about certain letters in the Torah, but in terms of the text, the Septuagint perfectly corresponds to the text of our Torah, and it wasn't even preserved by the Jews. It was preserved by Christian churches. Now, Christianity also rose long before Islam. Another 600 years would pass between Christianity and Islam, and all the time the various Christian churches had Septuagint and other translations of the Torah. There were translations into, for instance, Aramaic languages, various versions of it, the Pshita of the Syriac translation that was preserved by certain Eastern churches. And all of these translations, the difference between them and our text of the Torah is on the level of letters at most. It's not a question of that there would be a paragraph of text, for instance, in Septuagint, but not in our Torah, in terms of at least the 5 books of Moshe we're talking about. In case I think of certain later books like the Megillat Esther, some Midrashim made it into the translation. We have that in the Aramaic translations too of the book of Esther. So that's a little bit different. But in terms of the Chumash, at least, the 5 books of Moshe and the Parshat of Tochecha and everything written in it, there's no question that that's what the Torah said, at least from that period of time on. Of course, I believe that the Torah was given at Sinai, but I'm talking about even from the point of view of minimalists who don't believe that. There's no question that at least long before the second exile, the Torah was already, at least the 5 books of Moshe were already exactly as the text that we have now, with the question of maybe some letters being different. So, coming back to the 2 exiles, according to some sages, and even before the Vilna Gaon, this was already mentioned in the Ramban's commentary of the Torah, and then even in the Zohar Hadash itself, in Zohar Hadash on Parshat KiTavo already. It mentions, that might be the earliest source for this, depending on when the Zohar Hadash was written, this idea that the 2 exiles correspond to the 2 Parshat of Tochecha. Now, not all our sages agree with this, by the way. Abarbanel and certain other sages argue and say that we're considering actually one big exile. The whole time of the Second Temple was mostly, even when we had our own kingdom, it was not an easy time, and later the descendants of Hashmonaim were not particularly righteous either. And then, of course, when Hordas came to power, it was very turbulent times. So, since majority of Jews were outside the land of Israel, and the Second Temple was lacking certain things that the First Temple had, as the Talmud tells us. So, therefore, there is a different approach, according to which there is one big exile, basically, including the entire time of the Second Temple. And it's hinted in both this week's parsha and the reading of KiTavo. Both Tochechot, both rebukes are hinting to actually the same long time period. So you don't have to specifically match those Tochechot in this parsha to the First Temple destruction and the Tochechot into KiTavo to the Second Temple destruction. According to Abarbanel, you do not have to match it that way, and they don't necessarily match that way. But as I said, the Shita of the Vilna Gaon and the Zohar, based on the Zohar, and Ramban gives a lot of proofs to his Shita. Ramban in this week's Parsha writes this very elaborately, trying to prove that this week's Parsha corresponds to the First Temple destruction and the other Parsha to the Second Temple destruction. So whatever the case may be, now we're pretty much approaching the end of our exile, the end of Torah after the first, after Parshat KiTavo, after the second destruction, talks about a long period of time when the land will be pretty much empty, which it was, and then the gathering of the exiles, and it comes together with Teshuva. This is a very important point. What the early Zionism lacked in a very major aspect, they had the nationalist aspect, but they didn't have the aspect of the Teshuva. What actually happened later, both in Israel and in America and in other countries, is a great Teshuva movement. A lot of people, including myself, of course, who came from a religious background. I was born in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. Today, there is not a country where I was born in, not a city where I was born in. It's called differently now. Not even the streets in that city. Everything changed. Who would have thought, right, that in just a few years everything would change so much? But I was born in a completely atheistic country, and many of the former Soviet Jews, of course, became religious. Many of the American Jews, totally assimilated, became religious. So the time now is what the Torah talks about in Parshat Nitzavim. Maybe we'll talk about it someday when we get to it. But the parsha that we'll be reading this week is talking about possibly the first exile and the destruction of the first temple and all those terrible punishments that will come to our nation when we don't listen to Hashem. And I hope that we will change our ways and listen to Hashem, and that Hashem will have mercy on us just like He promised, and the Jewish people will exist with righteousness and with bringing light to the entire world.